Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Crispy Kareem and I make videos in which I say my opinion, comment on certain subjects and get things off my chest, and you've come to listen for some reason. So thank you. If you like what you've heard and what you've seen, please subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, leave a nice comment and share it with your friends and your loved ones. And if you don't like what you see, then condemn me to a life of car dependency in an American suburb, because that is my personal hell in the dunya. Obviously not like hell, like I don't want to abuse that word, so may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive me for using that word, because I am going to talk about some Muslim stuff. This is the Ramadan upload, second one that I wanted to do. It's 5 months late, but I'm so excited. I wanna upload this and I can't believe I'm gonna get this. So yeah, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Let's get into this subject. I was originally just gonna go on TikTok and make a TikTok response video to this, but I realized that this is a really deep subject that I want to talk about because I'm really into my urban planning. I'm subscribed to so many urban planning YouTube channels like Not Just Bikes and City Beautiful. I am about to do an apprenticeship in urban planning. So like, woohoo, I turned a hobby into a job. You know, it's gonna piss off the capitalists, but whatever. I am gonna do this for a living, and starting next week, as of recording this on the 9th of September, I'm so excited. Anyway, the context of this. So, about 9 months ago, towards the end of December 2021, this TikTok video was circulating Muslim Twitter, and it showed this mosque in the USA which had opened up a cafe which looks like it served the same kind of thing you would see in any upscale coffee shop in a heavily gentrified area, and it even had the same aesthetics, sort of. Well, you can paint your own picture of, but I'm gonna show the TikTok anyway.
What a beautiful idea to have a cafe in the masjid. This is Kahua, which is a new cafe that opened up in Adams Center in Sterling, Virginia. The artistry and the cozy, intimate vibes are exactly what I think is needed in masjid spaces, because oftentimes we feel disconnected from the person who's even praying right next to you. And by sharing a nice warm drink and sitting together, eating snacks and having a chat, you can get to know the person next to you, and that's really, really important. I love that this space exists, and I love that it's this beautiful. Every detail was put into place, and the coffee itself was delicious. I had the peppermint mocha, which was perfect. I absolutely think that spaces like this need to exist in our masajid, and I'm so happy to be a part of this community.
This TikTok generated a lot of conversation about the halalness of this whole thing and the amenities provided by mosques in the USA that are often not seen here in the UK. A lot of concerns included people going to the mosque with the wrong intentions because, they're not gonna primarily go to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're just gonna go and grab a coffee at a croissant or something, or whether there would be free mixing in the space, and the fact that one of the women working in the cafe in that video didn't have her hair covered, because in a mosque you're supposed to cover your hair. And on the other hand, there were a lot of comments lamenting the lack of amenities being provided by their own mosques in comparison to this. Like in some places, and this is, I'm pretty sure it's just a UK thing, even areas for women to actually use the mosque aren't even provided. So that's a very stark difference. I'm not going to make a judgment on whether this is halal or not. I'm not qualified to do this. I'm not a faqih, I'm not a sheikh, I'm not a scholar in Islamic studies and mosques. So that's something you can consult a scholar on. But I do already have quite a bit of knowledge on land use policy and development from my previous university studies and from my personal enjoyment of consuming content about urban planning and land use and suburban sprawl, which is what's going to come up, which is why I want to offer my 2 cents on this and give an explanation as to why this is what I want Muslims to take away from this. So to start off, I want to talk about land policy in the USA and how it's resulted in mosques in the USA or suburban USA becoming like this. So after World War II and in the 1950s, crude oil became very cheap, and that made the complementary good of a private automobile more attractive to buy because the long-term costs associated with owning one was going down. A lot of automobile and oil companies lobbied the government to enact land use policies that would sustain the increase in car ownership per capita, which involved tearing out historic tram lines and reducing public transportation provisions to their bare minimum to force as many citizens as possible to become as car dependent as possible. In response, North America developed a new American dream, which became the standard for what is expected of Americans in life, which is to get married and to raise a nuclear family in a single home suburb soon after leaving education. To facilitate this dream, so-called cookie-cutter homes were built en masse, and I think this term refers to how similar all the homes look, because they're building as many units en masse at a low cost per unit, and so they built them in new developed suburbs, which all had large front and back lawns. As a result, a lot of suburban sprawl happened in the 50s and 60s, which was also the time in which desegregation was happening as a legally mandated thing. However, because of a lot of racist attitudes, there was racist attitudes behind this policy, and so in a sense there is still segregation, but it's more socio-economic and spatial, rather than it being these are the fountains for the coloured people and these are the fountains for the white people. And so the majority of people who moved out into those suburbs were white people, whilst black people were left in the inner cities, and that caused a lot of economic decline in those inner cities. And as money kept being spent on developing new suburbs, despite the fact that the economic activity and the work continued to happen in cities because everyone would drive in. And obviously historic racism meant that white people made more than black people, so most black people couldn't afford to move out, and white people did afford to move out if they wanted to. And so I'll link some videos that explain this in more detail in the description box below, because it's a very important shift to explore, and vehicle emissions make up a massive proportion of the global emissions that are happening, which mainly come from Western Europe and Northern America. But in the UK it's a bit different. The UK does have its fair share of suburbs and low density areas. You know, in London we have places like Richmond, Totteridge, and those sorts of places, and these suburbs are not so much of a common thing with the houses. The actual building quality itself is different, and some of them aren't even as spaced out as the ones you'd see in an American suburb, and they have more public service provision, transport provision anyway, in London anyway, because it's not that hard to get to Barnet or Richmond on public transport. I've done it myself, and it hasn't happened to the levels of US cities, and it hasn't produced this heavy forced dependence on car use the way you have in the USA. And those suburbs do tend to be walkable anyway. They have better pavements, and they do lead to places. There are shops and businesses and things in their local areas. It's not like they all have to go into the city centre for things, especially with a growing business areas and new offices being set up outside of central London and what is currently considered zone 1 of the tube network. Places like Harrow and Orpington were once villages that surrounded London. They were part of County Middlesex, and eventual urban growth, especially during the Victorian times, would eventually, and following that, would eventually mean that they would be subsumed into what is now considered Greater London, and obviously that's its own history. The Jay Foreman video on that is really good, so that's something you can also learn about London in terms of urban growth and traditional people-based architecture. A lot of the movement into those cities was fueled by the Industrial Revolution that started in the 19th century, and it's created economic opportunities in cities that were not available in rural areas. So a lot of people moved to the cities at a much quicker rate than local governments could handle, and so a lot of slums developed, especially in those industrial areas, so like Stratford and the Docklands, and eventually those slums were cleared, both through government policies, but also a lot of London and British neighbourhoods were, and especially in the industrial areas, they were targeted by Nazis during the World War II, which meant that many were displaced, and that a lot of what London looks like today and other cities look like today is based on post-World War II reconstruction, which was based on the prevailing politics. And so what was that prevailing politics? Well, despite Britain and its allies being led to victory in World War II by Winston Churchill, he lost the following general election to the Labour Party when the latter campaigned on building Britain on a welfare state with a commitment to affordable healthcare, education and housing, and that's also how we got to the NHS. As a result, many council estates were built in the 50s and 60s, most of which comprised of medium and or high rises, especially in cities like London. Another thing that happened in London, specifically from the second half of the 19th century on, was that when the London Underground was expanding, it was building lines in previously rural areas and would build suburban developments around them where villages didn't already exist. And, again, they were going to existing villages as well, like Harrow and Orpington. And so what that did was ultimately create new urban/suburban areas that were designed for public transport usage, because they were built by at the time, private companies that built those lines, so like the Central London Railway and the Metropolitan and District Railway, which built places like the eastern end of the Central Line, or I think that might have been built by Great Eastern or the Eastern Anglia Railway, I'm not sure, and the Metropolitan and District Railways, which had the Metroland scheme out to Amersham and at the time also ran to Aylesbury, but that's now handled by Chiltern Railways. And that was going on in the early 20th century, so before World War II, but later in the 20th century we'd get the London Passenger Board and Underground Electric Railways of London and so on, would eventually lead to the local regional government running and funding of what is today the London Underground route that is part of the wider Transport for London route, which also includes the Overground and the DLR and the buses and the etc. There's a lot, and alhamdulillah for that. So they don't really resemble American suburbs. They were built by different companies, so they vary from place to place. Some of them involve townhouses, some of them involve more sparsely developed housing and lower density stuff. But because they also went to these lines also went to the former villages that were amalgamated into the area today known as Greater London, that they have their own mini centres of economic activity, and so they are more walkable than American suburbs. And it's really only in very affluent areas where you have the same level of density that your typical American suburb would have, and the American, the British house, the British areas, it's much more high quality rather than flimsy housing. And so overall, this is why British cities and cities overall outside of the American Gulf haven't experienced the same level of sprawling that North American cities have, and so they're not as car dependent. So it's also shown how different Muslim communities in the USA and the UK are. So I had to do quite a bit of research on that in the USA, because the mass immigration patterns that I'm familiar with that forms the British Muslim community did not happen towards the US, and the main mass immigration that happened in the USA were from East and Southeast Asian countries, which are not predominantly Muslim for the most part, with the exception of being Indonesia and Malaysia. But I don't see that many Indonesian Americans, Malaysian Americans, get as much as you see like, oh, this person's Thai, this person's Vietnamese, this person's Japanese, etc. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that the USA has approximately 5 times the population of the UK, the raw number of the Muslim population in each country is roughly the same, and as a result, they make up a much smaller percentage of the total population in the former country. From what I've heard, a large proportion of Muslim immigrants in the USA are from middle-class backgrounds, and this is largely due to the strict restriction on immigration in the USA. One thing I do know is that the Muslim community in the USA is more pluralistic in its ethnic backgrounds, with a balance of Arabs, South Asians, Black people, along with other ethnic backgrounds. However, the discourse of what it means to be Muslim in the USA seems to be dominated by Arabs, and there seems to be a cultural domination of Arabs in Muslim institutions in the USA. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I did do some research on Muslims in the USA to see if the stuff I've heard online adds up. And my Google search led me to the Pew Research Center, which has statistics on Muslims and immigration. They said things that indicated in certain aspects Muslims have the same socioeconomic outcomes as non-Muslims in the USA, as they're overall equally likely to hold a degree. However, that number is higher for Muslims who are immigrants, and in order for them to achieve that, they would have to emulate a similar lifestyle to what is within the status quo of North America, which is generally suburban living. So because more Muslims, the rate of degree achievement is high with Muslim immigrants, they are more likely to seek out your typical middle class job that would get one to be living in that typical American suburb with the house and the car and the big yard. This suburban living is heavily dependent on car usage for every single trip, including going to the mosque, and the extreme commodification and privatization of land As a result of this, many Muslims in the USA are extremely dependent on mosques as a space to build community and meet up and socialize, because public spaces and places of congregation where one isn't expected to spend money or can get harassed for loitering if they spend too long there are so scarce. There are also so many other reasons why people might meet up at the mosque with others. The mosque is a neutral location, so it doesn't put pressure on one person in particular to entertain the others when meeting up. They also host a lot of Muslim-oriented activities and classes that would appeal to Muslims and bring them together physically, and overall, as an environment, they bring about more taqwa, which means that social gatherings that happen in mosques are often done with awareness and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and are kept halal. That doesn't negate from the fact that the primary purpose of mosques is that it is a space for prayer and worship for Muslims, but the idea that the only thing to do in there is pray and read Quran is something that only seems to exist in the minds of UK Muslims, as far as I know, and it has poor consequences on how we view and use our mosques in comparison to those in the USA and more traditional Muslim communities around the world. I know quite a bit more on Muslims in the UK because I am a Muslim in the UK and I grew up around other Muslims, so a lot of the local history I've heard about surrounds immigration from majority Muslim countries. A large proportion of today's Muslim population descend from immigrants from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, which were formerly British colonies and had recently gained independence from the British Empire. During the 50s, many South Asian people migrated to the UK to take up industrial roles and earn a better wage than they would have in their home countries and send some of their income back to the families that remained. The reason this came about was that many factory workers had died in World War II and the UK was still a largely industrial economy. Meanwhile, imperial exploitation of resources in South Asia by the British Empire had impoverished the majority of its people, which meant that the UK had easy access to human capital to sustain its manufacturing sector. Eventually, as a result of modern globalization, around the 60s and 70s, the UK transitioned to a service-based economy, and its manufacturing sector moved to countries like China and India, where labor cost less and, once again, it was in abundance. Therefore, the areas in which many of these South Asians settled went into decline and became poor. These areas include Birmingham, Liverpool, and London, mainly East London, but there are also a lot of South Asians in other parts of London. South Asian immigration didn't stop at that initial wave, but those areas have been attractive for people coming directly from those countries to the UK because these areas contain people from a similar cultural and linguistic background. Therefore, it helps to mitigate fears about cultural shocks because for those immigrants, there's a taste of back home, and there are people with the same experience that they can reach out to for support on living in a new country. A lot of non-South Asian Muslims who migrate to the UK also come from former British colonies. Nigerians make up a massive proportion of black Muslims in the UK, but overall black Muslims only make up 10% of Muslims in the UK, and Arab Muslims like myself only make up 7%, whereas South Asians, both people who are fully South Asian, people who are mixed Asian, make up approximately 70% of Muslims in the UK. These figures are from the 2011 census. I could not find data from last year's census, so these figures might be out of date, but I can't do anything about that. So there is a massive overlap between working class and South Asian in this country, although it's not a perfect overlap, but both of these are relevant, and that's why I spoke about ethnic makeup earlier, because when you look at immigration waves and international relations of each country, you'll realize that it really shapes the culture and the mindset of each Muslim community. So, because many Muslims live in major cities like London and Manchester, and British cities are much more walkable than most American cities, even as we see funding cuts to our public transport, because, as I said earlier, our infrastructure and culture isn't geared towards forcing the majority of the population to be dependent solely on car use for everything. So most people can walk to the mosque, myself included, and it's likely that they do. Also, in these cities, most mosques tend to have to be built compactly, and some are repurposed properties, and in old parts of London, like the Soho Islamic Society, so they don't have the space to build extra things like cafes and gyms, but because they're in the middle of a metropolitan area, they don't need to do it either. But yes, the mosques here do tend to be smaller, and is much more expensive in the UK because you have obviously high demand for it in a city, and a lot of regulations surrounding the acquisition of land because of green belt stuff, which means the city can't just expand out in an unmitigated way. As I said earlier, I managed to find the name of this mosque from American Muslims who had utilized its services, talking about it in the replies on Twitter. As you can tell from the video, this area is very clearly one of those car dependent areas, and the mosque in which this area is situated simply adapts to that without any question, really. I'm gonna now show you an example of some mosques in the UK. I'm gonna go to East London Mosque, but before that, I'm gonna start off with a more local mosque that's just down the road. So I've loaded up Google Maps, and this is the mosque here in red, All Dulles Area Muslim Society, or ADAMS for short, and this over here is Washington DC. There with this is in Virginia, and it's as we zoom in, we can drag my face camera thing because it was blocking the zoom in thing, but this is, as we get in, we can see that it's off the highways, just on the main road. This is where the mosque itself is, so we'll just drop our pin here. We have some residential areas, sort of medium density developments here, which is nicer to see and better for population growth environmentally. But unfortunately, because of the wide road and the lack of a pavement on this side, it doesn't look like it's very easy to cross the road from here to there. So if you were living across the road from the mosque, you'd have to walk across the grass and then hope that there aren't any cars on what is quite a wide road. And unfortunately, because of how car-centric American laws and culture is, it's very unlikely that you as a pedestrian would have right of way in terms of crossing. But this is the mosque itself. It has a parking lot in the front, as we can see, and that's something I found very weird, and it's not the first time I've seen it. I remember when a few months ago I saw a video being shared by Daniel Hakikachu. I don't follow him, but it got retweeted onto my timeline, where some people were there was some priest was talking about how comes the parking lot to the mosque is full, even not on Fridays of their holy day, but I can't get that many people to come to the church, and that's dedicated to Christianity. And I just thought, oh my god, that's so weird. They have a parking lot. Like, well, that's how normal driving to the mosque is in America. But this is the mosque itself, and it has a gymnasium, it has classrooms, and congregatory areas. No faces are being really revealed in that. So that's the mosque. It's basically, and this is again the cafe. You can get that sort of bougie look, and then these are the kinds of residential areas, or looks like I've messed up that one, that you get with the single family housing that's really far apart. So it's I don't know what the public transport situation is here, but in this area, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was rubbish. I'm aware that Washington DC does have a metro, but it doesn't seem to reach this area, so that's not very relevant. But whatever. So as you can tell from the video, this area is very clearly one of those car-dependent areas, and the mosque in which this area is situated simply adapts to that without any question, really. I'm gonna now show you an example of some mosques in the UK. I'm gonna go to East London Mosque, but before that, I'm gonna start off with a more local mosque that's just down the road. So this more local one here is Bow Muslim Cultural Centre. If we just go in, we can see that even though it's on the side of a major-ish road in London, it's still quite your run-of-the-mill local mosque in the United Kingdom. You've got some housing here, you've got a sweet shop. If you go, there's you go further down, there's even more housing, and you'll eventually get to some shops. You just go past this church. You've got and another church, في الأهل اللبنانيين اللي بيؤمنوا بكل الأديان والطوائف. You've got a laundrette and a cash and carry and whatnot. And then we'll go to East London Mosque, which is a bit bigger. This is one of your more regional mosques that you'll see every now and then. And that's the one where it attracts quite a lot of speakers. They have quite a reputation with the Muslim community in East London, so they are quite well known. And then you can see what's around it. So this is East London Mosque. It's quite big. It's you know it used to be there used to be a synagogue here, actually, because this used to be a predominantly Jewish area until the 50s, when I think they all moved up to like Barnet and Stamford Hill and those places. But you have again Islamic Relief have a charity shop here. It's a perfect place really for it. There's housing. There's a gym. Why would the mosque need to build one when Pure Gym literally have set up a gym there? There's restaurants. There's a cycle lane. There are some bus stops nearby. I don't know exactly where they are, but there's buses into the city of London proper. You've got buses to Ilford and Stratford. You've got stuff up to Euston and Paddington. You've got buses up to Hackney and again Stamford Hill. Get those Jews able to go to their ancestors of their neighbourhood ancestry. Oh god, I've really lost my words. But you've even got a park here for people to hang out. So it's really shows like the stark difference in how British and American Muslims have when it comes to the built environment in which they live. And obviously it's not a single story for all of them, but I think it definitely a lot of people do fit in that those specific kind of a lot of people do fit in that those specific kind of community structure in terms of the built environment, because that is an important thing to think about when we conceptualize how Muslims utilize the mosque and get to the mosque, and how much of a role the mosque plays in the lives of Muslims in different areas. I also want to show some examples from Lebanon, just to give you an idea of more traditional Muslim communities, rather than just comparison between the USA and UK. and I'm going to give you some examples that I'm more familiar with. So I'll show you one from Beirut, which is a bit more contemporary, and then I will show one from Trablus as well. So, for example, there is this is just Beirut layouts overall, and then we have Hamza. I do not know where the mark for this is, but I know where the mosque is. So this is, I believe, this mosque is called Hamza ibn al-Khattab Mosque. It's over here. It's the actual location is a bit awkward because it's between a bunch of main roads. Unfortunately, Beirut has very bad public transport, but it does not have the despite having large highways running through it, it also still has a sense of walkability and walkable neighborhoods. As you can see, you have the high rises, you have the shops and everything. This is near the Tariq al Jadida area, so you have again the mosque really being fitted into the local area, which is why it's so tall. And it's again there to sort of adapt to the local area in terms of the actual layout, because you can't exactly have something wide and spread out in Beirut, and even that as a mosque, it would not be serving a wide area of residents simply because of how much of the area is made up of residential buildings that are 4 to 8 stories high or even more. So like maybe 1 or 2 residential roads could fill up that mosque, but 1, 2, or 3 like larger residential roads. And so I'll go over to Tripoli to show you something more historical. Okay, so I had to look for the correct place, but this is basically Tripoli, Lebanon. This is just the wider area with Al Mina over there. But this is a more traditional example for context, even though Tripoli has been continuously inhabited since the Phoenician times, so about 5 to 7,000 years old. As Tripoli, as we know, you can see it now, was the old city was constructed by the Mamluk dynasty, which whose capital was in Egypt, Cairo, Egypt, and this was their second largest city. So as you can tell, this is an entrance to a mosque or possibly a madrasa, and this is literally the old souk running through it. So shops everywhere. There's literally apartments right above. This is mixed use development is treated as this new innovative thing when it's really just going back to traditional urban planning and how we used to build things because that's how things were built. And Tripoli is a very beautiful city. I'd recommend visiting it. It's also the poorest city in Lebanon. I'm going to see if I can find the Tanyal Mosque just to give you an idea of what kind of area it's serving. It's quite a high population density here that they're dealing with in Lebanon, so it's building upwards is how things have always happened, and it doesn't necessarily have to be correlated with poverty. It's just a very traditional thing, and I wish more people were aware of just how normal this kind of building is when it comes to traditional Muslim communities. So that just shows what traditional Muslim communities look like, I guess, and what happens when you don't throw out the inclusivity when it comes to urban planning and how Muslims fit into different built environments. And when I was planning this video, I didn't really think about the takeaway I wanted from this, but thinking about it, I do definitely want Muslims to think more about their built environment and sustainability, because urban sprawl and car usage on such a level as seen in America just really is not sustainable. It's also important not to take for granted the circumstances that deem it unnecessary for mosques to, build their own cafes and gymnasiums and whatever. And I just think that it's good to really think about cities and urban planning, not the kind of thing Muslims generally go into because you have to be a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor or a failure in your family, and that typical brown kid diaspora joke that we've all told ourselves at some point. But it's important because obviously it generated a lot of conversation, as you've seen, and I really hope it's something that we can reflect upon and that we can do better as for as long as this dunya exists, before it's all gone and the day of judgment brings upon us, what we did here. And I think that by dedicating work to creating a better built environment here for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and making mosques more accessible and having them in more accessible walkable cities, I think that we please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we create earn good deeds because we build that community that really gets us to reinforce the taqwa and iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in the prophets and the angels and the day of judgment and the books that have been brought upon us. So this was quite a long video. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't usually make very long videos. This was scripted, it took me ages to write, and I'm hoping to get my next one done a bit quicker because I want it out by Halloween. So thank you again for watching my video. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share with your friends and loved ones, and make sustainable choices for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And may we be blessed, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive me if I got anything wrong in this video. Bye bye.